A story from the echoes of ashes.
Edrik's axe bit deep into the wood, the steady rhythm of his work echoing through the crisp morning air. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields that had been his family's livelihood for generations. From the farmhouse, the familiar scent of baking bread wafted out, mingling with the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil. Edrik wiped the sweat from his brow and straightened, looking toward the house where his wife, Mara, stood at the door, their young daughter clinging to her skirts. "Breakfast is ready," Mara called, her voice carrying a warmth that momentarily chased away the unease Edrik had been feeling for weeks. He smiled, setting the axe aside. "Coming, love." Inside, the house was filled with the sounds of a life well lived. Pots clattered, their daughter giggled as she played with a carved wooden sheep, and the fire crackled in the hearth. "Your hands," Mara chided as Edrik reached for a piece of bread. "Wash them first." Edrik chuckled, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "Yes, ma'am." For a while, the world seemed normal. They ate together, talking about the planting season, the stubbornness of the sheep, and their plans for the next market day. But Mara's laughter was quieter than usual, and Edrik caught her glancing toward the window more than once. Edrik sat on the porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the hills. Mara joined him, cradling a steaming mug in her hands. "It feels different," she said softly, her gaze distant. He frowned. "What does?" "The air, the land." "There's something wrong, Edrik. I can feel it." He placed a reassuring hand on hers. "It's just the stories from the traders, Mara. We're far from the cities. Whatever's happening out there won't reach us here." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. The fields hadn't yielded as much this year, and the livestock had been restless, skittish at shadows that didn't seem to move. "I just want to keep her safe," Mara whispered, her eyes flicking toward the window where their daughter slept. "We will," Edrik said firmly. "I promise." Days turned into weeks, and Mara's unease grew. She began locking the doors and windows earlier each evening, glancing nervously at the darkening sky. She spoke of dreams filled with whispers and shadows, of voices telling her to protect their child at all costs. Edrik tried to comfort her, but he couldn't ignore the changes. The sheep began to vanish one by one, their carcasses found torn and twisted at the edge of the woods. The crops withered overnight, their leaves blackened as if scorched by unseen flames. Mara's once cheerful demeanor faded into paranoia. She refused to let their daughter play outside and insisted on keeping a knife under her pillow. "I see them," she said one night, her voice trembling. "They're watching us from the trees." "There's nothing there," Edrik said, though he didn't entirely believe it himself. It was a stormy night when everything fell apart. The wind howled, and the shutters rattled as rain lashed against the farmhouse. Edrik was in the barn, trying to calm the remaining sheep, when he heard Mara scream. He ran, his heart pounding, and burst into the house to find her standing in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she held a bloodied knife. "Mara," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, tears streaming down her face. "I had to, Edrik. They were coming. They would have taken her." He looked past her, his stomach dropping as he saw their daughter's lifeless form cradled on the floor, a faint smile still on her face as if she had been soothed into sleep. "No," his voice was a broken whisper as he fell to his knees. Mara sank to the floor, the knife clattering from her hands. "I saved her. I saved us." Before Edrik could move, she grabbed the knife again, plunging it into her chest with a sob. He caught her as she fell, her blood soaking into his shirt. Her lips moved, barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I couldn't let them." Her eyes closed, leaving Edrik alone in the suffocating silence. The farm felt hollow now, every corner haunted by their absence. The whispers Mara had spoken of seemed louder, more insistent, as if mocking his grief. He couldn't stay. There was nothing left for him here. Taking his axe and a few provisions, Edrik set out down the dirt road, his steps heavy with sorrow and a growing resolve. The world was crumbling, but he wasn't ready to give in. Edrik trudged along the muddy path, the weight of his axe a comforting presence on his back. The wind carried the scent of decay, mingling with the damp earth beneath his boots. His steps were slow, each one heavy with grief, but he moved forward, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The whispers Mara had spoken of followed him now, faint and indistinct. Sometimes they sounded like her voice, soft and pleading. Other times, they were guttural and foreign, like the growls of some unseen predator. He tried to block them out, but they seeped into his mind like smoke through cracks in a wall. By the third day, he reached a crossroads. The signpost was weathered, its writing faded, but one direction was clear, the road to the nearest village. He hesitated. Mara's voice echoed in his mind, "Stay away from the cities, that's where it spreads." But he needed answers. He needed to know what had happened to his farm, to his wife and daughter. And, deep down, he needed to know if there was anyone left to fight whatever had done this. The village was eerily silent as Edrik approached. The once bustling market square was deserted, its stalls overturned and rotting. Doors hung ajar, swinging gently in the breeze, and the windows of the houses stared out like hollow eyes. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing in the emptiness. Only the wind answered. He stepped cautiously into the square, his axe gripped tightly in his hands. The ground was littered with signs of struggle, broken pottery, dried bloodstains, and deep gouges in the dirt. Near the fountain, he found the first body. It was a man, his face frozen in terror, his hands clutching a crude weapon. His chest was torn open, the edges of the wound blackened as if burned. Edrik knelt beside him, his stomach twisting. He wasn't sure if the cause was grief, fear, or the faint odor of rot that clung to the body. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, though he knew no answer would come. He stood, scanning the surrounding buildings. Something moved in the shadows near the inn, a flicker of motion, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice steadier than he felt. No response. Edrik advanced cautiously, his grip tightening on the axe. The inn's door creaked open as he pushed it with the blade's haft. The air inside was stale, the smell of spilled ale and decay stronger here. "Stay back," came a hoarse whisper. Edrik froze. The voice was weak but alive. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "Come out." A figure emerged from behind the bar, a woman, her clothes torn and bloodied. She clutched a broken chair leg as a weapon, her eyes wild and sunken. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not safe." "What happened?" Edrik asked, keeping his distance. "They came," she said, her gaze darting to the door. "They're not human, not anymore. They took everyone. Only a few of us made it out." Edrik's throat tightened. "What do you mean? Who are they?" She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You'll see. They always come back." Before Edrik could press her further, the sound of footsteps echoed outside, slow, deliberate, and heavy. "They're here," she whispered, backing away. Edrik turned to the door, his heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, joined by the sound of scraping metal. Shadows flickered across the doorway as something approached. He gripped his axe, his knuckles white. "Stay behind me." The figure that stepped into the light was barely recognizable as human. Its flesh was pale and stretched tight over twisted bones, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Its hands ended in claws, and its mouth twisted into a snarl. Edrik didn't wait. With a roar, he charged, swinging his axe in a wide arc. The blade bit into the creature's shoulder, but it barely flinched. It lashed out with inhuman speed, its claws raking across Edrik's arm. He stumbled back, gritting his teeth against the pain. Behind him, the woman screamed. The creature lunged again, and Edrik swung upward, the axe embedding itself in its chest. This time, it collapsed, its body convulsing before falling still. Edrik stood over it, breathing heavily. The whispers in his mind grew louder, almost triumphant. "You killed it," the woman said, her voice trembling with awe. Edrik pulled his axe free, his jaw set. "What are they?" She shook her head. "The corruption. It takes them, twists them. There's no saving anyone once it takes hold." Edrik spent the night barricading the inn, using whatever furniture and debris he could find to reinforce the doors and windows. The woman, whose name he learned was Sarah, helped as best she could, though her hands trembled with every nail she hammered. As dawn broke, the whispers in Edrik's mind began to subside, replaced by a grim clarity. This wasn't a fight he could run from. Whatever this corruption was, it had taken his family, his village, and now threatened the entire world. He couldn't bring Mara and his daughter back, but he could honor their memory by fighting back. "Sarah," he said as they prepared to leave the village. "You said some people escaped. Where did they go?" "There's talk of a refuge," she said. "A place where the Lightpact is gathering survivors to make a stand." Edrik nodded, gripping his axe tightly. "Then that's where we're going." The road stretched ahead, flanked by twisted trees whose gnarled branches clawed at the sky. Sarah walked beside Edrik, her makeshift weapon clutched tightly in her hands. Neither spoke much, their footsteps the only sound against the oppressive silence. The land itself seemed to change as they moved closer to the rumored refuge. The grass was brittle and gray, the air heavy with an acrid scent that stung their eyes and throats. Occasionally, they passed abandoned carts or homes, their occupants either fled or fallen. "We'll be safe there," Sarah muttered, almost to herself. "The Lightpact will know what to do." Edrik glanced at her, his expression unreadable. He wasn't so sure. The whispers in his mind had returned, softer now but insistent. They spoke of betrayal and despair, of hope lost in the face of overwhelming darkness. "How far is it?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Not far," Sarah said. "A day, maybe less if we keep moving." As the sun dipped below the horizon, they found shelter in the remains of a stone chapel. The roof had partially collapsed, and the altar was shattered, but it was defensible. Sarah lit a small fire using scraps of wood and dry grass, and they huddled close to the flickering flames. "This place used to be holy," she said, her voice barely audible. "You can feel it, can't you? Like, something's missing." Edrik nodded. The air inside the chapel felt wrong, like a hollow echo of what it should have been. He ran his fingers along the grooves in the stone floor, tracing patterns that seemed to pulse faintly beneath his touch. "What's the Lightpact?" he asked after a long silence. Sarah looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "They're what's left of the old orders, the warriors, priests, anyone willing to stand against the corruption. They say the gods bless them with strength, though I'm not sure I believe it. Do you?" She hesitated. "I don't know. But they're fighting, and that's more than most." The next day, they reached the outskirts of the refuge. It wasn't much, just a fortified encampment nestled in the shadow of a craggy hill. Wooden palisades surrounded it, and smoke from cook fires rose into the gray sky. As they approached, a guard stepped forward, his armor dented and mismatched but serviceable. He held up a hand. "State your names and purpose." "I'm Edrik," he said. "This is Sarah. We're looking for shelter." The guard eyed them suspiciously, then motioned for them to enter. "You'll want to speak to Commander Alrik. He's in the main tent." The camp was a flurry of activity. Men and women sharpened weapons, repaired armor, and sorted through dwindling supplies. The air buzzed with tension, a collective unease that mirrored Edrik's own. They found Alrik in a large canvas tent at the center of the camp. He was a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, his expression hard but not unkind. "You're not the first to find your way here," he said after hearing their story. "And you won't be the last. The corruption is spreading faster than we can contain it. What are you doing to stop it?" Edrik asked. Alrik sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "We hold the line where we can. Burn the bodies before they rise again. But it's like fighting the tide with a bucket." "There has to be a way," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "Something more we can do." "There is," Alrik said grimly. "The Lightpact believes the source of the corruption lies in the ruins of a city to the north. We're gathering what forces we can for a final push." Edrik clenched his fists. "Then let me fight." Alrik raised an eyebrow. "You've lost much already. This isn't a fight you're likely to survive." Edrik met his gaze, unflinching. "I have nothing left to lose." Edrik spent the next days training with the others. He wasn't a warrior, but years of farm work had made him strong, and his grief had hardened into a quiet, unyielding resolve. Sarah stayed by his side, her fear gradually giving way to determination. Together, they learned to wield the crude weapons the Lightpact provided, their bond forged in shared desperation. The whispers in Edrik's mind grew louder at night, filling his dreams with visions of fire and ash. He saw his farm burning, his wife's pleading eyes, his daughter's lifeless form. But he also saw glimpses of something else, a blinding light cutting through the darkness, a hand outstretched toward him. When the day came to march, Edrik stood among the ragged line of recruits, his axe gleaming in the pale sunlight. The Lightpact's banner fluttered above them, its symbol, a radiant sunburst, both a promise and a challenge. "We go now to face the darkness," Alrik said, his voice carrying across the assembled fighters. "Not for glory, but for survival. For those who cannot fight. For those we've lost. For the Lightpact," the fighters echoed. Edrik gripped his axe tighter, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a battle. It was the beginning of something far greater.